On the morning of March 14th, 1919, the people of New Orleans opened their newspapers and read something that would change their city forever. The Times-Picayune, the most respected newspaper in Louisiana, had published a letter on its front page. Not a letter from a politician or a celebrity. This was a letter from a killer. A serial killer who had been terrorizing the city for nearly a year, breaking into homes in the dead of night and attacking sleeping families with their own axes. And now, he was speaking directly to the people of New Orleans. The letter began, "Hell, March 13th, 1919. Esteemed mortal of New Orleans, they have never caught me and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a fell demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman." People reading this over their morning coffee must have felt their blood run cold. The killer was not just a man. He claimed to be a demon, and he was writing to them personally with dark humor and theatrical flair. But the letter got stranger. The Axeman had a request, or rather, a demand. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I'm going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. Read that again. A serial killer was telling an entire city to play jazz music on a specific night, or he would kill them. The letter was signed simply, "The Axeman." This was not a hoax. The police confirmed that details in the letter matched information that had never been made public. The person who wrote this letter knew things that only the killer could know. The city of New Orleans, already traumatized by a year of midnight terror, now faced an impossible choice. Do you ignore the letter and risk becoming the next victim? Or do you give in to the demands of a monster? The answer came 5 days later, on the night of March 19th, 1919. And it was a night that New Orleans would never forget. Before we continue this story, I want to ask you something. If you believe these dark chapters of American history deserve to be remembered, if you believe we learn from understanding our past, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing. Your support allows us to keep exploring the shadows of history. Tonight, we will walk the dark streets of 1919 New Orleans. We will stand in the homes where families slept, never knowing that a demon with an axe was about to break through their door. We will read the letter that terrified a city. We will witness the night when an entire city played jazz to ward off death. And we will chase the ghost of a killer who was never caught, never identified, and who simply vanished into history. This is not just an unsolved mystery. This is a story about terror and community, about how a city responds when a monster comes calling. It is a story about the power of fear and the strange, dark beauty that can emerge when people face the inexplicable together. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. To understand the Axeman, we must first understand New Orleans in 1918, because the city he terrorized was already living through a nightmare. The Great War, World War I, had just ended in November of 1918. Thousands of young men from New Orleans had gone to fight in Europe. Many had not come home. The ones who did return brought stories of horror that made the comfortable people of America realize that the world was more brutal than they had imagined. But there was another war happening, one that killed even more people than the fighting in Europe. The Spanish influenza pandemic was sweeping across the world like a biblical plague. In New Orleans, people were dying by the hundreds every week. The morgues were full. The hospitals were overwhelmed. Bodies were buried in mass graves because there weren't enough coffins. People wore white surgical masks when they walked down the street. They avoided crowds. They feared their neighbors' coughs. Death was everywhere, invisible, carried on the very air they breathed. The city was traumatized, exhausted, grieving. And into this darkness came something new. Something that couldn't be blamed on a virus or the cruelty of distant empires. Something that came in the night with an axe and killed for reasons no one could understand. The Axeman had arrived. Joseph Maggio was 41 years old. He and his wife, Catherine, ran a small grocery store on the corner of Upper Line and Magnolia Streets, in a working-class neighborhood where Italian immigrants had built their community. The store was on the ground floor of a wooden building, and the Maggios lived in the rooms above it, their home connected to their business. Joseph and Catherine were not wealthy, but they were respectable. They worked hard. They were good neighbors. They went to church. They were living the American dream, two immigrants who had built a life for themselves through honest labor. On the night of May 22nd, 1918, they went to bed like they had 1,000 times before. The store was locked. The doors were secure. They fell asleep in their bedroom with no idea that someone was already inside their home. The next morning, Joseph's brothers, Jake and Andrew, arrived to help open the grocery store. When Joseph didn't answer their knocks, they let themselves in with a spare key. And they found a nightmare. Joseph and Catherine were in their bed, soaked in blood. Both of their throats had been cut with a straight razor. Catherine's head had been nearly severed from her body, the wound so deep that her head lolled at an unnatural angle. Joseph was still barely alive, making terrible gurgling sounds, drowning in his own blood. The brothers screamed for help. Neighbors came running. Police were called, and as they searched the apartment, they found the weapon. In the bathroom, leaning against the wall, was the Maggios' own axe. It was covered in blood. Someone had used it to attack the couple in their bed, striking them with terrible force, fracturing their skulls. Then, when they were unconscious and helpless, the killer had taken Joseph's straight razor from the bathroom and finished the job. But the most chilling detail was how the killer had entered. The back door of the apartment, which led to the alley behind the store, had a panel that had been carefully chiseled out. Not smashed, not kicked in, but chiseled. A precise, almost surgical removal of a section of the door, just large enough for a person to reach through and unlock the door from the inside. Someone had done this quietly, in the dark, while the Maggios slept just feet away. Joseph Maggio died before the ambulance arrived, and as the police processed the crime scene, one of them noticed something written in chalk on the sidewalk, just outside the grocery store. The message read, "Mrs. Maggio is going to sit up tonight, just like Mrs. Tony." The officers looked at each other. Mrs. Tony. They knew that name. 7 years earlier, in 1911, a woman named Mrs. Tony Sciambra, known as Mrs. Tony, had been murdered in her bed. She and her husband ran a grocery store, just like the Maggios. The killer had broken in during the night, attacked them with an axe, and vanished. The case had never been solved. The police suddenly realized something terrible. The Maggio murders might not be the beginning, they might be the continuation of something that had been happening for years, lurking in the shadows, striking and then waiting, patient as a spider. If that was true, then this killer had been in New Orleans for at least 7 years. And he was still hunting. The investigation into the Maggio murders was going nowhere. There were no witnesses, no physical evidence that pointed to anyone specific. The Italian community was frightened, but the city at large tried to convince itself that this was an isolated incident, a robbery gone wrong perhaps, a personal grudge, not something that would happen again. They were wrong. On the morning of June 27, 1918, just over a month after the Maggio murders, police were called to another grocery store. This one was owned by a man named Louis Besuma, a Polish immigrant who lived above his store with a woman named Harriet Lowe. The scene was sickeningly familiar. A panel had been chiseled out of the back door. Besuma and Lowe had been attacked in their sleep with an axe, their own axe, taken from the store's woodpile. Both were gravely wounded, but alive. Blood was everywhere, but this time, there was a survivor who could talk. Harriet Lowe, drifting in and out of consciousness, made a strange accusation. She claimed that Louis Besuma was a German spy, that he had attacked her, that this was all part of some conspiracy. Remember, this was 1918. America was at war with Germany. Paranoia about German spies and saboteurs was everywhere. The police, desperate for any explanation, arrested Besuma, but Harriet's story didn't make sense. If Besuma had attacked her, who had chiseled out the door panel? Why would he use that method to enter his own home? And how did this connect to the Maggio murders? Harriet Lowe died from her wounds a few days later, and her dying words, accusations of German espionage, only confused the investigation further. Louis Besuma was eventually released. The evidence didn't support his guilt, and the police were forced to face an uncomfortable truth. The real killer was still out there. By the summer of 1918, a pattern was emerging, and it was a pattern that filled the Italian immigrant community of New Orleans with a cold, creeping dread. The victims were almost all Italian grocers and their families, small business owners who lived above or behind their stores, people who worked hard, saved their money, and were seen as successful within their community. The attacks always happened at night, between midnight and dawn, when the victims were asleep and most vulnerable. The killer always gained entry by chiseling out a panel in a door, usually the back door, the one that faced an alley or a dark street where he wouldn't be seen. This took time and effort. This required tools and skill. This was not a crime of passion or impulse. This was methodical. The weapon was always an axe, specifically the victim's own axe, found on their property. The killer never brought his own weapon. He used what he found at the scene, and the most terrifying detail, the killer took nothing. No money was stolen, no jewelry, no goods from the stores. Whatever the motive for these attacks, it wasn't robbery. So what was it? Why was someone systematically attacking Italian grocers? Was it a vendetta? Was it the mafia, punishing people who refused to pay protection money? Was it a madman who had some twisted grudge against this specific community? No one knew, but everyone was afraid. On the night of August 5th, 1918, the Axeman struck twice. The first attack was on the Cortimiglia family. Charles and Rosie Cortimiglia were a young couple with a 2-year-old daughter named Mary. They lived behind Charles's grocery store on the corner of 2nd and Jefferson Streets. In the early hours of the morning, a neighbor heard screams. When police arrived, they found a scene of horror. All 3 members of the family had been attacked with an axe. Little Mary, just a baby, was dead. Her skull had been crushed. Charles and Rosie were both gravely injured, but alive. As Rosie lay in the hospital, barely conscious, the police asked her if she knew who had done this, and she gave them an answer. She said it was their neighbors, Orlando and Frank Giordano, a father and son who lived next door. The Giordanos were arrested immediately. Rosie insisted they were guilty. She said they had attacked her family out of jealousy, out of some business dispute, out of reasons that were never quite clear. But there was a problem with her story. The Giordano home showed no signs of the blood that should have covered the attackers. The chiseled door panel, the Axeman's signature, didn't fit with a neighbor simply walking over and attacking them. And most damning, on the same night the Cortimiglias were attacked, there was another attack across town. Joseph Romano, an elderly Italian grocer, was assaulted in his bed. He was struck in the head with an axe and died 2 days later from his wounds. His nieces, who slept in nearby rooms, heard the attack and ran to help. They saw the attacker fleeing, a tall, heavy-set man in a dark suit and a black slouch hat, running into the night. The description didn't match the Giordanos at all, but Rosie Cortimiglia wouldn't change her story. The Giordanos were tried, convicted, and sent to prison. A father and son, innocent men, locked away while the real killer walked free. And everyone knew it, because the attacks didn't stop. The summer of 1918 was a season of terror in New Orleans. Multiple families attacked, multiple people killed, and the police had no real leads. They had arrested the wrong men. They had no physical evidence. They had no witnesses who could identify the killer. The Italian community was paralyzed with fear. Families slept with weapons next to their beds. Some abandoned their homes and grocery stores, moving in with relatives or leaving the city altogether. People installed extra locks, barricaded their doors, left lights burning all night to ward off the darkness. But none of it mattered, because the Axeman moved like a ghost. He could find a way into any home. He could strike without warning and vanish without a trace. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the attack stopped. Fall arrived, then winter. The Spanish flu continued to kill thousands, but the Axeman seemed to have disappeared. Weeks passed, then months, with no chiseled doors, no midnight axes, no blood-soaked bedrooms. Had the killer died in the flu pandemic? Had he moved to another city? Had he simply stopped? The city allowed itself to hope. Maybe it was over. Maybe the nightmare had ended. But in March of 1919, the people of New Orleans learned the terrible truth. The Axeman hadn't left. He had just been waiting, and now he was ready to speak. The envelope arrived at the offices of the Times-Picayune newspaper with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter, several pages long, written in neat, educated script. The editor who first read it must have thought it was a prank. The letter claimed to be from the Axeman, the serial killer who had terrorized the city the previous summer. But it had been months since the last attack. Most people wanted to believe the killer was gone, that the danger had passed. The editor kept reading, and as he did, he realized with growing horror that this was no prank. The letter contained details about the crimes that had never been made public. It referenced things that only the killer or the police would know. And the tone, the dark, theatrical voice that spoke from the page, had a quality that was impossible to fake. This was real. The editor called the police. Detectives came to examine the letter. They compared it to their case files, and they confirmed what the editor had suspected. This letter was genuine. The Axeman had broken his silence, and he had chosen to speak not to the police, but to the people of New Orleans. The question was, should they publish it? Publishing the letter would cause panic. It would confirm that the killer was still out there, still active, still a threat. It would terrify an already traumatized city, but the letter contained a specific threat, a deadline. If the newspaper kept it secret and people died because they hadn't been warned, that would be unconscionable. The decision was made. On March 14, 1919, the letter was published on the front page of the Times-Picayune, and the entire city read the words of a demon. Let me read you the letter in full, because it is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of American crime. The voice that speaks from this page is educated, theatrical, darkly humorous, and utterly chilling. Hell, March 13th, 1919. Esteemed mortal of New Orleans. They have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a fell demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman. When I see fit, I shall come and claim other victims. I alone know whom they shall be. I shall leave no clue except my bloody axe, besmeared with blood and brains of he whom I have sent below to keep me company. If you wish, you may tell the police to be careful not to rile me. Of course, I am a reasonable spirit. I take no offense at the way they have conducted their investigations in the past. In fact, they have been so utterly stupid as to not only amuse me, but His Satanic Majesty, Francis Joseph, etc. But tell them to beware. Let them not try to discover what I am, for it were better that they were never born than to incur the wrath of the Axeman. I don't think there is any need of such a warning, for I feel sure the police will always dodge me, as they have in the past. They are wise and know how to keep away from all harm. Pause here. Listen to that voice. This is not the raving of a madman. This is someone intelligent, articulate, mocking the authorities with sophisticated contempt. The reference to His Satanic Majesty, Francis Joseph. That's Franz Joseph I, the Emperor of Austria-Hungary, who had died during World War I. This is someone educated enough to make literary and historical allusions in a serial killer manifesto. The letter continues, and this is where it gets even stranger. Undoubtedly, you Orleanians think of me as a most horrible murderer, which I am. But I could be much worse if I wanted to. If I wished, I could pay a visit to your city every night. At will, I could slay thousands of your best citizens, for I am in close relationship with the angel of death. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time, on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I'm going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. Read that again slowly. A serial killer was telling an entire city to play jazz music on a specific night, Tuesday, March 19th at 12:15 a.m., or he would kill them. This was unprecedented in criminal history. Killers had written to newspapers before, Jack the Ripper had sent letters to London papers in 1888. But never had a killer made such a specific, bizarre demand of an entire city. The letter concluded, "Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, and it is about time I leave your earthly home, I will cease my discourse. Hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee. I have been, am, and will be the worst spirit that ever existed, either in fact or realm of fancy." The Axeman. When the people of New Orleans read that letter over breakfast on March 14th, the city exploded into chaos. Some people thought it was a hoax, a sick joke by some prankster trying to cause panic. But the police confirmed it was real. The killer had struck again, they said. Not with an axe this time, but with words. And his new weapon, fear, was just as effective. Others took the letter literally. The Axeman claimed to be a demon, a spirit from hell, and in New Orleans, a city with deep roots in Catholicism, voodoo, and spiritualism, the supernatural was not something to dismiss. People went to church to pray. They consulted fortune tellers. They performed rituals of protection. The Italian community, which had borne the brunt of the attacks, was terrified. They had 5 days until Tuesday, March 19th. 5 days to decide. Do we play jazz and hope this madman keeps his word? Or do we ignore him and risk becoming the next victims? The music stores across the city were flooded with customers. Everyone wanted to buy jazz records, sheet music, instruments, anything that could produce the sound of jazz. The stores sold out within days. A local composer, inspired by the letter, wrote a song called "The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, Don't Scare Me, Papa." It was published and sold thousands of copies. The sheet music featured a cartoonish drawing of a wild-eyed man with an axe, surrounded by musical notes. The city was transforming its terror into music. And as Tuesday, March 19th approached, the excitement mixed with the fear. This was going to be a night unlike any other in the history of New Orleans. When the sun set on Tuesday, March 19th, 1919, the city of New Orleans was already humming with nervous energy. As darkness fell, the music began. It started in the dance halls and nightclubs. Every establishment that had a band, and many that didn't, threw open their doors and played jazz. The streets of the French Quarter filled with music pouring from every doorway. Louis Armstrong, who was just 17 years old at the time, played his cornet in clubs packed with people desperate to dance away their fear. But it wasn't just the professional venues. Ordinary people in their ordinary homes were playing jazz too. Families who had never owned a record player before gathered around their new purchases, playing scratchy recordings of jazz bands. People who had bought instruments just days earlier were attempting to play them, producing sounds that were more noise than music. But it didn't matter. It was jazz. It would protect them. Some people hired small bands to play in their living rooms. Others simply banged on pots and pans in rhythm, calling it jazz and hoping it would be enough. Children were kept awake past midnight, dancing in their nightclothes because their parents were too afraid to let them sleep. The entire city was awake. The entire city was playing music. And as midnight approached, as the clock hands moved toward 12:15 a.m., the earthly time the Axeman had specified, the music reached a fever pitch. Imagine it. A warm March night in New Orleans. Every window lit and open. Jazz pouring from every building, every home, every street corner. Thousands of people dancing, playing, singing, drinking. Some laughing with nervous energy, others praying under their breath. It was beautiful. It was absurd. It was a city-wide ritual, a mass act of sympathetic magic. A city trying to ward off a demon with the one weapon he had told them would work: jazz. And at 12:15 a.m. exactly, when the Axeman had said he would pass over New Orleans, the music was at its loudest. The whole city was a cacophony of trumpets, clarinets, pianos, drums, and human voices raised in defiant celebration. Then came the waiting. As the night wore on, people began to wonder, was it working? Would the Axeman keep his word? The sun rose on March 20th, and as the light spread across New Orleans, the city learned the answer. There had been no attacks, no chiseled doors, no blood, no bodies. The Axeman had kept his promise, or at least, he hadn't killed anyone that night. The people of New Orleans had danced with death, and they had survived. The city erupted in relief, exhaustion, and a strange sort of triumph. They had faced down a demon with jazz music, and it had worked. But we must ask ourselves, what really happened that night? Did the Axeman genuinely spare the city because they played jazz? Or did he never intend to attack on that night in the first place? Was the entire letter a game to him, a way to exert control over an entire city without even touching an axe? Did he sit somewhere in the darkness, listening to the music, watching the chaos he had caused, and enjoy it? Or, and this is perhaps the darkest possibility, was he out there in the crowd? Was he walking through the French Quarter, moving among the people who were terrified of him, dancing to the very music he had demanded they play? Was the Axeman at his own party? We will never know. But what we do know is this: the letter worked. It didn't stop the killing, we'll get to that. But it accomplished something else. It made the Axeman famous. It made him legendary. It transformed him from a serial killer into a myth, a story, a demon who could command an entire city to dance. And perhaps that's what he wanted all along. Not just to kill, but to be remembered, to become immortal. If that was his goal, he succeeded. For a while after the jazz night, there was peace. Weeks passed with no attacks. The city began to relax, to hope that maybe the Axeman had been satisfied by their performance. Maybe he had moved on. Maybe it was finally over. But the people who believed that didn't understand the mind they were dealing with. The Axeman wasn't done with New Orleans. He was just taking a break. And when he came back, in the hot summer of 1919, he would prove that all the jazz in the world couldn't protect everyone. The final attacks were coming, and they would be just as brutal, just as inexplicable as everything that had come before. Spring turned to summer. April passed, then May, then June and July. No chiseled doors, no midnight attacks, no letters in the newspaper. The Axeman had gone silent. The people of New Orleans tried to return to normal life. But normal was a relative term in 1919. The Spanish flu pandemic was finally winding down, but it had killed over 3,000 people in New Orleans alone. The returning soldiers from World War I were struggling to readjust to civilian life. The city was exhausted, traumatized, trying to rebuild, and hanging over everything was the question: where was the Axeman? Some people believed he was dead, claimed by the flu like so many others. Some thought he had left New Orleans, moved to another city to hunt new victims. The optimists believed he had simply stopped, that whatever dark compulsion had driven him to kill had burned itself out. The police had no answers. They had investigated every lead, questioned every suspect, followed every theory. They had arrested the Giordanos, but everyone knew they had the wrong men. The real killer was a ghost, leaving no fingerprints, no witnesses, no trail to follow. And then, in August of 1919, the ghost returned. Sarah Laumann was the wife of a druggist. She and her husband lived in a comfortable home in a respectable neighborhood. They were not Italian. They were not grocers. They didn't fit the pattern that had defined all the previous attacks. But on the morning of August 3rd, Sarah Laumann was found in her bed, her head crushed by an axe. She was still alive, barely, rushed to the hospital with terrible injuries. She would survive, but her memory of the attack was fragmented, confused. She remembered waking to pain and darkness, nothing more. The back door of her home had a panel chiseled out. The Axeman was back, and this time, he had changed his victim profile. If he would attack Sarah Laumann, a woman who had nothing in common with the Italian grocers, then that meant no one was safe. Anyone could be next. The city's brief sense of relief evaporated. The fear came flooding back, worse than before. In early September, something remarkable happened. Rosie Cortimilia, the woman who had testified against Orlando and Frank Giordano, came forward with a confession. She had lied. She stood in the offices of the Times-Picayune, the same newspaper that had published the Axeman's letter, and she recanted everything. The Giordanos were innocent. They had not killed her daughter. They had not attacked her family. She said she had accused them out of jealousy, out of some petty neighborhood dispute, out of rage and grief that needed a target. But they were innocent. She had sent innocent men to prison, and the guilt was destroying her. The Giordanos were released immediately. Father and son walked out of prison, their reputations destroyed, their lives in ruins, but at least they were free. But Rosie's confession confirmed what everyone already knew. The real Axeman had never been caught. He was still out there, and he was about to kill again. Mike Pepitone was 41 years old, married, and the father of 6 children. He was an Italian grocer, running a small store on the corner of Scott and Oloa Streets. He and his wife shared a bedroom, and their children slept in adjacent rooms in their home behind the store. In the early morning hours of October 27th, 1919, a Monday just before dawn, Mrs. Pepitone woke to the sound of a struggle in the bedroom. In the darkness, she saw a figure standing over her husband's bed. A tall man, heavy-set, wearing dark clothes and holding something long in his hands. Before she could scream, the figure fled. She heard footsteps running through the house, then the sound of a door opening and closing. The killer was gone. She rushed to her husband. Mike Pepitone's head had been split open by an axe. Blood covered the bed, the floor, the walls. He was still alive, gasping, but the wounds were catastrophic. The children, woken by their mother's screams, came running. They saw their father dying. They saw the blood. They saw the axe, their own axe, from the store's woodpile, lying on the floor. Mike Pepitone died before the ambulance arrived. His 6 children watched him take his last breath. The back door had a chiseled panel. Mrs. Pepitone was interviewed by police. She had seen the killer, if only for a moment. She described him as tall, heavy-set, dressed in dark clothing. It matched the description that Joseph Romano's nieces had given over a year earlier. Finally, there was some consistency in the witness accounts. But the description was still too vague. Tall, heavy, dark clothes. That could be thousands of men in New Orleans. It wasn't enough to catch him. And besides, by the time Mrs. Pepitone was talking to police, the Axeman was already gone. vanished into the pre-dawn darkness like he always did. After Mike Pepitone's murder, the Axeman simply stopped. Days passed, weeks, months. No more attacks, no more letters, no more chiseled doors or bloody axes. The city waited, tense and afraid, for the next attack. Every unexplained noise in the night, every shadow in an alley, every stranger walking past a grocery store, it all fed the paranoia. The Axeman could strike at any moment, but he didn't. The fall of 1919 turned to winter. Winter turned to spring of 1920. Still nothing. Slowly, very slowly, the city began to believe that it was really over, that the Axeman had truly vanished. Whether he had died, moved away, or simply stopped killing, the result was the same. The nightmare was ending. But for the Pepitone family, for Mike's widow and his 6 orphaned children, there was no relief. The Axeman had taken their husband and father, and whoever he was, he had gotten away with it. Mrs. Pepitone, her first name was Esther, grieved. And as the months passed, her grief slowly transformed into something else. It transformed into rage. On December 7th, 1920, over a year after her husband's murder, Esther Pepitone was walking down a street in Los Angeles, California. She had moved there after Mike's death, trying to build a new life for herself and her children, trying to escape the memories of that terrible night in New Orleans. And then she saw him. A man walking toward her on the sidewalk, a tall, heavy-set man, and Esther Pepitone knew him. She recognized his face, his walk, the way he moved. This was the man she had seen standing over her husband's bed, axe in hand. This was the Axeman. His name was Joseph Mumfre. Esther didn't hesitate. She pulled a gun from her purse, a gun she had been carrying every day since her husband's death, waiting for this moment. And she shot Joseph Mumfre multiple times in broad daylight, in front of witnesses. He died on the sidewalk, and Esther Pepitone stood over his body and waited for the police to arrest her. At her trial, she claimed that Joseph Mumfre was the Axeman of New Orleans, that he had killed her husband and terrorized her city, that justice had failed, so she had delivered it herself. She was convicted of murder and sentenced to 10 years in prison. She served 3 years and was released. But was she right? Was Joseph Mumfre really the Axeman? Joseph Mumfre was a career criminal. He had a long record of arrests and convictions for burglary, robbery, and assault. He was a violent man with connections to organized crime. And when investigators looked into his background, they found something interesting. His prison records showed that he had been incarcerated during some of the long gaps between Axeman attacks. Specifically, he was imprisoned during the quiet period from fall 1918 through early 1919. He was released in early spring of 1919, right before the attacks resumed. And after Mike Pepitone's murder in October 1919, Mumfre left New Orleans and moved to Los Angeles. The attacks stopped when he left. On the surface, it seemed like a perfect match. Esther Pepitone had killed the Axeman. But there were problems with this theory. First, Mumfre was imprisoned during the August 1918 attacks, the ones on the Cortimiglia and Romano families. If he was locked up, he couldn't have committed those murders, unless there were 2 killers, which seems unlikely. Second, Mumfre's criminal record showed no history of axe murders or anything similar. He was a thief and a thug, not a serial killer with a specific theatrical MO. Third, the timing wasn't perfect. There were some attacks that happened when Mumfre's whereabouts couldn't be accounted for, but there were also some attacks that happened when he could prove he was elsewhere. And finally, there was no physical evidence linking him to any of the crime scenes. No witnesses who identified him, no axe with his fingerprints, nothing concrete. Just the word of a widow who had seen a shadowy figure in her bedroom for a few seconds in the dark. Was Esther Pepitone right? Or did she kill an innocent man? Or at least, a man who was a criminal but not that criminal, because she needed someone to blame for her husband's death? We will never know for certain. Joseph Mumfre is dead. He can't defend himself or confess. And the Axeman, whether it was Mumfre or someone else entirely, took his secrets to the grave. The attacks stopped after Pepitone's murder. That much is certain. Whether they stopped because the killer died, or moved, or was arrested for some other crime, or simply lost interest, we don't know. What we're left with is a series of brutal, inexplicable murders. At least 12 people attacked, at least 6 people killed. A letter that terrorized a city and forced them to dance, and a mystery that has never been solved. The Axeman of New Orleans is gone, but he left behind questions that haunt us over a century later. Who was he? Why did he kill? Why did he write that letter? Why did he demand jazz? Why did he stop? And the biggest question of all, is he really gone? Or is he still out there, somewhere in the pages of history, laughing at us for never figuring it out? Over a century has passed since the Axeman's last attack. Generations of detectives, journalists, historians, and amateur sleuths have tried to solve this case, and we are no closer to the truth than the police were in 1919. This is one of the most frustrating aspects of the Axeman case. We have so much information, witness descriptions, crime scene details, the letter, and yet it all leads nowhere. Every theory has holes. Every suspect falls apart under scrutiny. The killer covered his tracks perfectly, or was simply lucky, or both. Let's examine the major theories one by one and see why none of them fully explain what happened in New Orleans between 1918 and 19. Theory 1. Joseph Mumfre. We've already discussed Joseph Mumfre, the man Esther Pepitone killed in Los Angeles. Let's look more carefully at the evidence for and against him being the Axeman. Evidence for his prison record somewhat correlates with the gaps in attacks. He was a violent criminal with mob connections. He left New Orleans after the last murder. Esther Pepitone identified him as the man in her bedroom. The attacks stopped after he was killed. Evidence against. He was provably in prison during some of the attacks. No physical evidence links him to any crime scene. His criminal history doesn't include anything similar to the Axeman's MO. The timeline isn't perfect. There are discrepancies. Esther only saw the killer for seconds in the dark. The Mumfre theory is popular because it provides closure. It gives us a name, a face, a resolution. But the evidence is circumstantial at best, and the holes in the timeline are significant. Was Mumfre the Axeman? Possibly, but we can't say for certain. Theory 2. The Mafia. New Orleans in the early 1900s had a significant Italian immigrant population and a mafia presence. The fact that most victims were Italian grocers led many to suspect organized crime. The theory goes like this. The victims were being punished for refusing to pay protection money to the mafia. The attacks were meant to terrorize the Italian business community into compliance. Evidence 4. Most victims were Italian grocers. The mafia did operate protection rackets in New Orleans. Some of the crime scene details suggested professional criminals. The attacks had a ritualistic quality that could suggest organized crime messages. Evidence against. The mafia typically uses more straightforward methods: shootings, beatings, bombings. Why the elaborate method of chiseling doors? Why not just break in or shoot through a window? Why write a theatrical letter to the newspaper? The mafia avoids publicity. Some victims, like Sarah Laumann, had no connection to the Italian community. Nothing was stolen. If this was about money, why not take it? The mafia doesn't typically kill children, Mary Cortimiglia. The mafia theory was popular at the time, but it doesn't hold up well. The Axeman's methods were too strange, too theatrical, too personal. This doesn't fit the pattern of organized crime hits. Theory 3. A serial killer. This is the theory most modern criminologists favor. The Axeman was a serial killer, a lone predator driven by psychological compulsion, rather than rational motives like revenge or profit. Evidence 4. The attacks fit the pattern of serial murder. Same method, same victim type, no clear motive. The letter shows a need for attention and control, common in serial killers. The sexual component, attacking people in their beds, in intimate settings. The escalation and then sudden stop. Many serial killers stop due to death, imprisonment, or psychological burnout. Modern profiling suggests a white male, probably living alone, with manual labor skills, the chiseling. Evidence against. Serial killers usually have a specific victim type. The Axeman's victims varied. The long gaps between attacks are unusual for this type of killer. Most serial killers take trophies or stage bodies. The Axeman didn't. The letter is extremely unusual. Most serial killers don't communicate this way. The serial killer theory is probably the closest to the truth, but it still doesn't explain everything. The letter, in particular, is an anomaly. Very few serial killers in history have written anything like it. Theory 4. Multiple killers. Copycat. Some researchers have suggested that there wasn't one Axeman, but several. That the first attack inspired copycats who used the same method. Evidence 4. Explains the variations in MO and victim type. Explains the long gaps between attacks. Explains why the attacks stopped permanently. Multiple killers stopped independently. The Maggio murder could have inspired others. Evidence against. The method was extremely specific, chiseling door panels. The letter suggests one intelligence behind the crimes. Copycats usually make mistakes that reveal they're not the original. That didn't happen here. Too much consistency in technique for multiple independent killers. The copycat theory is interesting, but unlikely. The signature method, the chiseled panel, was too distinctive and too labor-intensive to be widely copied. Theory 5. The supernatural. I include this not because I believe it, but because it's important to understand how people at the time thought about these crimes. Many people in 1919 New Orleans believed the Axeman was exactly what he claimed to be. A demon. Not a metaphor, not a madman calling himself a demon, but an actual supernatural entity. Remember, this was a city with deep roots in Catholicism and voodoo. The idea of evil spirits, of possession, of curses. These were not abstract concepts. They were real possibilities in many people's worldview. The letter itself encouraged this interpretation. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a fell demon from the hottest hell. Evidence. 4. No one ever saw him clearly or caught him. He seemed to vanish impossibly. The crimes seemed motiveless, almost random. The letter's tone was otherworldly. He stopped suddenly, as if returning to hell. Evidence against. There is no such thing as demons. Every supernatural aspect has a rational explanation. Physical evidence, chiseled doors, stolen axes, proves a physical person. Serial killers often seem supernatural because they're good at not being caught. The supernatural theory tells us more about the fears of 1919 New Orleans than about the actual crimes. But it's a reminder that unexplained evil can feel supernatural, even when it isn't. The truth is, we will never know who the Axeman was. Too much time has passed. The physical evidence is gone. The witnesses are dead. The case is permanently cold. We don't know his name. We don't know what he looked like. We don't know where he came from or where he went. We don't know why he killed or why he stopped. All we have is the shadow he left behind, the testimony of terrified witnesses, the letter that terrified a city, the graves of his victims, and the music, the strange, dark, beautiful memory of a night when an entire city played jazz to ward off a demon. The Axeman of New Orleans has become a legend, a permanent fixture in the city's dark mythology. His story has been told in books, documentaries, podcasts, and even a season of American Horror Story. But unlike many serial killer cases, the Axeman isn't glorified. He isn't romanticized. Perhaps because his crimes were so random, so inexplicable, so pointless, there's nothing to glamorize. He was just a killer, motivated by compulsions we can't understand, who caused immense suffering and then vanished. What makes his case unique is the letter. That extraordinary document, with its theatrical voice and its bizarre demand for jazz. It transforms the case from a simple, if unsolved, serial murder investigation into something stranger, a performance, a piece of dark theater. The Axeman understood something fundamental about fear and control. He realized that you don't need to be in someone's home to terrorize them. You just need to make them believe you could be. And by writing that letter, by speaking directly to the people of New Orleans, he made every person in the city feel like a potential victim. That's his true legacy. Not the people he killed, but the fear he created. The way he made an entire city dance to his tune, literally. But there's one more part of this story that needs to be told. Because the Axeman didn't just leave behind a mystery, he left behind real victims, real families who were destroyed, real people whose names deserve to be remembered. In all the focus on the killer, on his identity, his motives, his theatrical letter, we risk forgetting the most important people in this story. The ones who died, the ones who survived, the ones who lived in fear and grief long after the attacks stopped. They are not footnotes to a mystery. They are the heart of this tragedy, and they deserve to be remembered as more than just names on a list of victims. The Axeman of New Orleans attacked at least 12 people between 1918 and 1919. At least 6 of them died from their wounds. These are not complete numbers. There may have been other attacks that were never reported, never connected to the case, lost to history. But we know some names. Let me tell you who they were. Joseph and Catherine Maggio, husband and wife, immigrants who ran a small grocery store. They were the first victims we know of in this series of attacks. They died in their bed on May 23, 1918. Harriet Lowe. She lived with Louis Bessumer. She was attacked on June 27, 1918, and died from her wounds. With her dying breaths, she made accusations that sent an innocent man to jail because she was confused, in pain, dying. She deserves compassion, not judgment. Mary Cortimiglia. She was 2 years old, a baby. She died on August 5, 1918, her skull crushed by an axe meant for her parents. Her death is perhaps the most senseless, the most cruel of all the Axeman's crimes. Joseph Romano, elderly grocer, attacked August 10th, 1918, died 2 days later. His nieces saw the killer flee. Mike Pepitone, father of 6 children, attacked October 27th, 1919, died in front of his family. His widow would later kill a man she believed was his murderer. And there were survivors, Charles and Rosie Cortimiglia, who lost their daughter, Louis Bessumer, who was wrongly accused, Sarah Lauman, who suffered terrible injuries, others whose names we don't even know, who were attacked and lived but carried the trauma forever. These were real people. They had families who loved them. They had hopes and dreams and ordinary lives that were cut short by violence they didn't deserve and couldn't prevent. Was the Axeman Joseph Mumfre killed by a widow's revenge in Los Angeles? Was he a mafia enforcer, a lone serial killer, or something we haven't even considered? We will never know. Was the letter genuine, or was it written by someone else trying to capitalize on the fear? The police believed it was real, but we can't be certain. Why did he target Italian grocers? Why did he demand jazz? Why did he stop? We will never know. These questions have haunted New Orleans for over a century, and they will continue to haunt us because the human mind craves resolution. We want to know who he was. We want to understand why. We want the story to have an ending. But some stories don't have endings. Some mysteries remain mysteries, and sometimes the monster gets away. But there is one part of this story that transcends the horror. One moment that shows us something beautiful about humanity, even in our darkest hours. On March 19th, 1919, the people of New Orleans faced an impossible threat. A serial killer had written to them directly, had made a bizarre demand, had promised death to those who didn't comply. They could have panicked. They could have fled. They could have locked themselves in their homes and waited in terrified silence. Instead, they played music. An entire city, in unison, turned terror into celebration. They took the weapon their tormentor had given them, jazz, and they made it their own. They danced in the streets. They filled the night with sound. They transformed fear into defiance. It didn't stop the killing. Mike Pepitone would die 6 months later, proof that jazz couldn't really protect them. But for one night, the people of New Orleans showed us what it means to face the inexplicable together, to take something dark and make it light, to refuse to let fear have the final word. That night, when the entire city played jazz, New Orleans became more than a collection of victims. It became a symbol of resilience, of community, of the strange, stubborn beauty that can emerge when people face horror together. The Axeman wanted to be remembered as a demon, as an unstoppable force of evil, as the worst spirit that ever existed. But what we remember is not him. What we remember is the music. The night a city refused to die in silence. The night New Orleans turned death into a dance. The Axeman of New Orleans killed at least 6 people. He terrorized a city. He wrote a letter that remains one of the most bizarre documents in criminal history. And then he vanished, taking his identity, his motives, and his secrets with him. Over a century later, we still don't know who he was. But we know who his victims were. We know their names, their faces, their stories. And we know that they deserved better than to become footnotes to an unsolved mystery. So let us remember them. Let us remember the Maggio family, the Cortimiglia family, Joseph Romano, Mike Pepitone, and all the others whose lives were touched by this violence. Let us remember that behind every unsolved crime, there are real people who suffered, real families who grieved, real communities that were changed forever. And let us remember that night in March, when a city faced down a demon with nothing but jazz music and refused to surrender to fear. The Axeman wanted to be immortal. He wanted to be remembered as the worst spirit that ever existed. But in the end, what's immortal is not him. It's the music, the resilience, the refusal to let evil have the last word. That's the real story of the Axeman of New Orleans. If you found this story worth remembering, please like this video and subscribe. Share it with someone who loves true crime or unsolved mysteries. And in the comments, tell me, who do you think the Axeman was? Do you believe it was Joseph Mumfre, or do you have your own theory? Thank you for bearing witness to this dark chapter of American history. Thank you for remembering the victims. Thank you for listening. May the Axeman's victims finally rest in peace, and may the mystery that haunts us serve as a reminder that sometimes evil wears a human face. We just never see it clearly enough to name it.